Got me falling right back.
When you build an application in WPF, you're building a modern-looking application. But don't forget that even modern-looking applications still use menus. And you can place a menu wherever you want, but traditionally you'll place it in the upper left. And to do that, you can use a grid, you can use a dock panel, and you set the isMain property of the menu to true to indicate that it's a top-level menu. Menus consist of menu items, and the menu item is a container control. It has a header property that contains the actual menu item text. You can add an image to the menu item by setting the icon property, and then the click event occurs when the user selects a menu item. So here's an example of defining a menu in XAML. This XAML defines the file new and the file open menu choices. So the top level here is the file menu item. So the header is set to file. And then inside that are two menu items, one for new, one for open. Now inside the new menu item, I have a menu item.icon element, and then inside that I have an image, and I set the source to new document hs.png, which is the icon I want on the new menu item. Then after that I have the open menu item, inside that menu item.icon, and then inside that an image. As you know by now, XAML is all about containership, and so you can see here that defining a menu also takes advantage of containership. A context menu is a pop-up menu that exposes functionality specific to a particular control. So the user right-clicks on a control like a text box, and you want a menu to appear. To attach a context menu to a control, you use the context menu property of that control. So here we have a text box, and this text box is going to have a context menu associated with it. So after the text box element, this XAML defines textbox.contextMenu. That attaches the context menu to this text box, and then we define the context menu. Start out with context menu, and then after that use menu items, because a context menu is, of course, a menu. Let's go take a look at menus and context menus. I have the Advanced Controls Examples sample application running. Let's take a look at the menu examples. There's two of them, one that creates a menu, one that creates a context menu. Let's look at the menu first. And this is a very simple form which has a simple menu. On the File menu, I have New, Open, Save, Print, and Exit. On the Edit menu, the typical choices undo, redo, cut, copy, paste. I also have Preferences, where I can enable sound. And then on the Help menu, I have an About menu item. On the right, you see the XAML that defines this window. We start out with the dock panel, and then I have a menu docked to the top. So this menu is going to be docked to the top of the window. I set the isMain property to true to indicate it's the main menu. I set the maximum height to 25 because I want it to be a particular height and not move. And then I set the background to Alice Blue, a nice light blue to distinguish it from the rest of the window. Then I define my menu items. I have a File menu. The first item in there is new, so there's another menu item, header equals new. I give it a name and also hook up the click event handler. Then I want an icon to appear next to it. So the new menu item contains a menu item.icon, and then inside that I have an image, and I set the source equal to my new image. I do the same thing for open, save, and then notice between save and print there's a separator. There I add a separator element. So that's this right here. Then I have print, exit, etc. And I do similar things for the edit menu and also the help menu. Now if I click the file new, that's going to run some code. And that's going to be in the event handler. I haven't hooked up most of these, so file new, file open, file save, file print just indicate that you actually did something. The exit menu is going to close the window. And I did hook up some of the edit menu items because I have a text box here, so I could start typing. App dev courses are the best. I can highlight that code. I can copy it. I can paste it. I can cut, etc. Then I can undo, redo. So those menu choices are all wired up. And I'm just calling methods of the text box: undo, redo, cut, copy, and paste. Then under Edit, I have Preferences. The preference is to enable sound, so when I click that, the sound is on. And then notice that because the sound is on, that menu item is checked. So let's go look at the XAML for the Enable Sound menu item. And all I had to do is set isCheckable equal true. And that gives that menu item the ability to be checked. Then I want to know if it's checked. And I can just query that property at runtime. So if sound menu item is checked, is true, then I know the sound is now on. Otherwise, I know the sound is now off. Because this code here runs when the user clicks the menu item, and then can check if it's checked or unchecked. Isn't that boringly simple? And that, at the simplest level, is how you put together a menu. Let's look at the second example, where we have a context menu. I have the same main menu, but then inside the text box, I have a context menu. So I can type app dev experts are truly expert. Select that, and then when I right-click, I have choices for cut, copy, paste, undo, redo. In this context menu that belongs to the text box. So if I right-click anywhere else, that menu doesn't show up. When I right-click on the text box, it appears. Let's look at the XAML for this example. The main menu is the same. Here's where I define the context menu. I have a text box, and then inside the text box element, I have textbox.contextMenu. Then I define my context menu. And the menu itself is no different. It's a menu. It has undo, redo, cut, copy, paste. And I actually just copied these menu items from the menu item above. But I define it as a context menu, and then I attach it to this text box by using textbox.contextMenu. And that's why this context menu is associated with the text box. The scroll viewer is a content control that has both horizontal and vertical scroll bars built into it. And it's very handy when your content may not fit in a window and you want to enable scrolling. So for example, if you're showing instructions and you have 7 paragraphs that won't all fit in a window, or you're showing images, you have 12 images you want to show, they're not all going to fit in a window. You can put the content, the text, the images inside a scroll viewer, then you have built in the ability to scroll. You have control over when the scroll bars appear because you can set the vertical scroll bar and horizontal scroll bar properties. If they're set to auto, then the scroll bar, both the horizontal and vertical scroll bar, appear if needed and disappear when not needed. This is the default for the horizontal scroll bar. If you set these to visible, then the scroll bar always appears and is disabled if it's not needed. And that's the default for the vertical scroll bar. If you set it to disabled, then the scroll bar never appears, so the users can't scroll in the UI, and you also can't scroll programmatically. If you set these properties to hidden, then the scroll bar never appears in the UI, but you are allowed to scroll in code. You can add tabs to your UI by using the tab control and tab item elements. The tab control displays content on separate pages that users can view by selecting the appropriate tab. And then each tab is a tab item. So here's some XAML that creates a tab. First we start out with a tab control, and then inside there are two pages, one for subject, one for expert. So to define a page or a tab, this XAML uses the tab item element, and then the header contains the text that the users see. And when you change from one tab to another, the tab control selection changed event occurs. The group box is familiar to you if you've done Windows Forms development. It's a box with rounded corners and a title. And its typical use is to surround radio buttons or checkboxes. So here's some XAML that defines a group box. We have a group box element. The header says pick a subject. That's going to display in the box. And then inside the group box is a stack panel. Inside that are radio buttons. Now in Windows Forms, when you use a group box and then place radio buttons or checkboxes inside it, there's some sense of ownership between the group box and the radio buttons and checkboxes. In XAML, it's really more of a visual element. The radio buttons don't literally belong to the group box. The group box is really more of a border. The expander control is basically a header and then a collapsible content region. It's a handy device for managing real estate in your UI. So you'll have some text and then a circle with an arrow in it. The user clicks the arrow and the region expands, and then you can display content. When the region expands or collapses, the expanded and collapsed events occur, and you can also control which direction the region expands. The default is down, but you can also have the regions expand up, to the left, and to the right. This XAML defines an expander, so inside a stack panel we have an expander. The header is set to Robert Greene, so that text displays. And then inside the expander is a stack panel, and inside that is the content that's going to appear when the user expands the region. So let's go see how to use the scroll viewer, the tab control, the group box, and the expander in applications. Let's take a look at using the scroll viewer. In this window, I'm showing the app dev experts, and I display their image and their biography. There are 5 experts total, and that information is not all going to fit in this window. So to see additional experts, I can scroll down and then back up. Now, if the window is not wide enough to display all of the information horizontally, notice the horizontal scroll bar appears, and now I can scroll side to side. And then if I widen this again so it's wide enough to display all the information, the horizontal scroll bar disappears. Let's take a look at the XAML used to get this scroll viewer. And let me once again make this narrower so we can see the XAML. Here's the scroll viewer. I give it a name, and I've set its horizontal scroll bar visibility property to auto. I'll talk about that in a second, but inside the scroll viewer I have a stack panel, and then inside that stack panel I have 5 stack panels, one for each expert. And each expert stack panel contains the image and the text block with their bio. Now I've set the horizontal scroll bar visibility property here to auto, which is a bit redundant because that is the default, but I put it there because I'm going to change it in a second. Now the default behavior for the vertical scroll bar is that its visibility property is set to visible, meaning the vertical scroll bar will always be visible, and it will disable if the window is tall enough to display all of the content. The horizontal scroll bar visibility by default is auto, meaning that when it's needed, it appears, and when it's not needed, it disappears. Now I can change that, so let's come in here and set this property to visible, which is the default for the vertical scroll bar. Now when I run this, if the window is wide enough to display all of the content, the scroll bar is still there, but it's disabled. And it becomes enabled if it's needed. So you can decide which behavior you want in your applications. I actually kind of like the default behavior myself. So I actually prefer the horizontal scroll bar to appear only when it's needed and to not be there at all if it's not needed. But again, by changing this property to visible, you can have it be enabled or disabled. Now, in addition to scrolling up and down and side to side using the scroll bars, you can scroll in code. And the buttons on the left-hand side of the window give me the ability to do that. So if I want to scroll up and down a line at a time, then I can click line down, line up, line right, line left. Let's actually look at the code for these. So let's move this over here, get the code. And what I'm doing is calling methods of the scroll viewer, the line up, the line down, the line left, and the line right methods. Now, what do I mean by line here? Like, what does the runtime mean by line here? It really means a few pixels at a time. Now, I can scroll a page at a time by calling the page up, page down, page left, and page right methods of the scroll bar. There they are here. And by page, we mean even more pixels at a time. So both pages and lines are a fixed amount of pixels, pages being more than lines. Now notice as I page down, at the top of the scroll viewer is part of the expert above this expert, and as I page up, again, the experts at the top are being cut off, or as I page to the right, the experts are being cut off. And maybe I don't want that, so if I set the can content scroll property to true, and when I clicked that checkbox, what I did was I set the can content scroll property of the scroll viewer. Now when I page down, notice that we wind up at the top of an expert here. Yes, the experts are being cut off at the bottom, but they're not being cut off at the top. And if I page to the right, the experts are being cut off on the left, but the content is not cut off on the right. So I can scroll from element to element. So as I page down, I'm scrolling to the next image, or paging up, scrolling to this image here. And as I page to the right, I'm scrolling to this text block, and page left, scrolling to the image. If I click the home, top, end, or bottom buttons, then I'm going to call the scroll to top, the scroll to home, scroll to top, scroll to end, or scroll to bottom methods. So if I click home, I go to the very top. If I click end, I go to the bottom. If I click top, I go to the top, and bottom, I go to the bottom. So what's the difference between home and top, end and bottom? Well, if you're all the way over to the left, there is no difference. They just go up and down. But watch what happens if I scroll over to the right. If I click home, I go to the upper left. Whereas if I now go to the bottom right, if I click top, I just go straight up. And if I'm all the way over to the right on the top and I click end, I go to the lower left. But again, if I'm all the way up in the upper right and I click bottom, I go straight down. So there's a subtle difference between home and top and end and bottom. Home goes to the upper left, top goes to the top, end goes to the lower left, bottom goes straight down to the bottom. And if I want to scroll left and right, I have equivalent choices, and those are, where are they? They're in here somewhere. There they are. Scroll to left end, scroll to right end. Left end goes all the way over to the left, and right end goes all the way over to the right. So with this content, instructors' images and bios, there's a good chance that you'll just leave the users on their own to scroll up and down, left and right using the scroll bar. But if you were displaying textual content, maybe it's a contract or instructions, then the ability to scroll by line, by page, home, top, end, bottom, left end, right end, might actually be very useful. Let's move on to our next example. and those are headered content controls. And they're called headered content controls because they are content controls with headers. And the three we're going to look at are the tab control, the group box, and the expander. So in this window, I want to give users the ability to vote for their favorite app dev subject and expert. So I have two tabs, one for subject, one for expert. Let's take a look at the XAML first. Get the example back. Here we go. So I've defined a tab control, and that tab control has two tabs. So to create a tab, I use the tab item, and the header property determines the text that appears in the tab. So one for subject, and then down here one for expert. And then within the subject tab, I have a group box with a header, pick a subject, and then inside that a stack panel that contains the 4 radio buttons. If I click the expert tab, I have expanders. Let's take a look at the XAML and get this back. So the expert tab is a stack panel that contains 5 expanders, one for each expert. And an expander is a collapsible or expandable region of content. So if I click Robert Greene, for example, if I click the arrow next to Robert Greene, then after displaying a message box, I expand that region. The region contains a stack panel with an image and a text block. And if I expand Ken Gets, for example, I'm programmatically collapsing the Robert Greene region and expanding the Ken Gets region. Now notice that Robert Greene and Ken Gets both expand down. The other 3 experts expand in different directions, and the direction you expand can be controlled by setting the expand direction property. That's right here. So Don Kiley expands to the right, Dan Wallin expands to the left, and Doug Ware expands up. I don't know that you'd necessarily use all 4 of these at the same time on a single window, but those are your 4 options. Now when I click on Robert Greene, 2 things happen. One is I display a message box, and then the other thing is that any open regions collapse. That is not default behavior. I've actually asked for it. And when you expand a region, the expanded event handler occurs, and here I'm displaying the message and setting the isExpanded property of all of the other expanders to false. So for each of the expanded event handlers, for each of the expanders, when they're expanded, I'm making sure that the other regions collapse. You can certainly have multiple expanders expanded at the same time, but for this example, I only wanted one expanded at a time because that's how you vote for an expert. So when you click the vote button, first thing I want to do is find out which tab is selected. So if the user's in the subject tab, they pick a subject and click vote. I check to see if the subject tab item is selected, because then I know to go see which radio button is checked. If the user's in the expert tab, then I know to check to see which expander is expanded. Now in addition to expanding or collapsing regions or displaying a message box, what else might you do in the expanded event handler? Well, you might be displaying companies, and when the user expands the company region, you display information about the company and its logo. You might also want to display its sales for the previous year. Rather than bringing down all of that sales information at the beginning, you could run a query each time the user expands a region, and therefore only bring down that company's information when the user's looking at it. So what you've seen in this demo is how to use the scroll viewer, the tab control, and the expander to display a fair amount of information in an application, but also be efficient in your use of screen real estate. In this section, you've seen some neat tricks. Now, a lot of the examples you saw were nothing more than a new way to do the same things you've been doing for a very long time. But you also saw how you can pretty quickly and easily do things like add images to list controls. It's easy because of the XAML containership model, and this, in my opinion, is one of the key benefits to XAML. Before XAML, a list box that showed customers contained a list of strings, and the string was probably the company name. With XAML, the list box can contain anything: the company name and the logo, the company name, the full address, the logo, and a picture of its president. You're limited only by your ability to fit all the information you want into the space you have. So even though, like me, you have nothing more than the typical design skills of the typical developer, which ain't much, you can pretty easily create cool-looking applications using XAML.
Promise that you'll catch me.